He left $1 on a $42 bill, face down like a secret he hoped not to own. Alina flipped it over with dishwater slick fingers, eyes landing on the lonely portrait of Washington, and felt a heat rise in her throat that had nothing to do with the bacon heat lamps. A single buck for an hour of her time, her smile, her careful balancing of plates, her borrowed patience. It was almost funny, if the joke didn't have rent in the punchline. Before we begin, if this kind of story speaks to your heart, feel free to share where you're watching from. It's always beautiful to see how far stories like this can travel. Enjoy the story. The harbor and hearth sat at the edge of the wharf where gulls argued like fishermen and salt lived permanently in the window frames. On a February morning, the windows fogged from the inside, breath and coffee talking to the cold. Alina Soria adjusted the strap of her black apron with hands that smelled faintly of lemon and cheap antiseptic. She tugged the pen from behind her ear and tapped it against the check presenter to keep herself from thinking about numbers. From the corner, Noah, the bartender and the best kind of brother you find by accident, looked up from polishing glasses and mouthed you good. Alina answered with that light shrug she saved for being alive. She was not good. Her son Mateo's inhaler was empty, the pharmacy wouldn't refill until Tuesday, and the woman from the leasing office had left a note that began with termination and threatened to swallow the rest of the page. But you couldn't plate those facts, you couldn't pour them in a latte. So she smoothed the apron, pulled a smile across her tired, pretty face, and weaved between tables as if she had been born for this narrow ballet. Kelsey, the manager, wore her authority like perfume and a laminated name tag. "Alina," she said, catching her near the front as the door chimed, "you're 2 minutes late. Again." "Bus was early," Alina said, which was technically true. The bus was nearly always a beast welded from stubbornness and other people's choices. Kelsey clicked her tongue. "We can't keep covering for you. Your last month was messy." Alina swallowed. Messy meant the morning she took her son to the ER when his chest whistled like a tea kettle and didn't give the evening shift enough notice. The afternoon she fought over a phantom $48 from the tip pool. The night she took home a loaf of bread that would have been thrown out anyway and discovered via security camera that even Charity looked suspicious. "Understood," she said. She understood a lot of things. She understood that Kelsey saw the world through spreadsheets. She understood that the rent was due Sunday at midnight. She understood that life was a constellation of small humiliations you had to pretend were stars. The door chimed again, and the wind brought in a man in a gray coat, a dark high-neck sweater, and the kind of gaze that made you forget your own posture. He stood in the entrance a beat longer than most, like he was translating the room into a language only he knew. Not handsome in a movie way, but in the way of a city skyline, structured, relentless, complicated. He took a two-top by the window and did not, Alina noted, check his phone. "Table 13, Noah said under his breath. "Lucky." "Alina," Kelsey called, thrusting the menu towards her, "make sure he knows we have the seasonal scallops, and don't comp anything without authorization." Alina nodded and drifted to table 13 with that measured optimism that got her tipped more often than not. Up close, the man had faint freckles across the bridge of his nose, a detail that chipped the edge off his severity. "Good morning," she said. "Welcome to Harbor and Hearth. My name's Alina. Can I get you started with coffee, tea, something stronger for a Tuesday?" "Coffee," he said, voice warm and surprisingly soft. "Black, whatever is strongest." "What's strongest is the coffee," she quipped. It slid out a little too easily. When she tried to clip her humor, it only grew wings and flew around the room. The man's mouth tilted at the corners like he couldn't help it. "And a water with lemon, please," he added. By the time she brought the drinks, he'd moved his eyes from the window to the menu, but he wasn't really looking at the words, more as though he was giving the menu the dignity of consideration. "Any allergies, any preferences?" Alina asked her ritual questions as she poured water, slid coffee, left space for his hesitations. He ordered a simple breakfast, eggs over easy, wheat toast, avocado if it wasn't an affront to the season. He asked her about the kind of day mornings had been lately. Nobody asked that unless they were cruel or kind, and he didn't have the muscle memory for cruelty. "How do you answer that? You put sunshine in the pockets of the words and hand them to him." "It's like weather," Alina said, scribbling in her flip pad. "Things move through." The morning moved like a song you hummed because it did not have language. A family in matching puffy jackets asked which fish was least fishy. An older man with war stories written on his hands counted change with trembling fingers and ordered soup. Alina comped the slice of pie he pretended not to want and told Kelsey it had cracked in the case. Kelsey narrowed her eyes. Alina held them. There were 1,000 ways to be brave. Sometimes the smallest counted most. She checked on table 13 too often. The man never seemed irritated. He ate carefully, like each bite was a decision he could revise. On the third coffee refill, he asked how she took her coffee, and when she hesitated, he said, lightly teasing, "Let me guess, with air and hope." "Hope's expensive," she said. "I drink it black." He left the way certain people leave, like they don't want you to see them choosing. He stood, shrugged into his coat, and asked for the check. She brought it with the practiced cursoriness of service. Their fingers brushed when he took the presenter. Something like static. He paused. "Thank you," he said, and it was a richer thank you than the job asked of him. She nodded, thanked him back, one of those small rituals that keep the world from coming apart. The rush surged. When she cleared his table 5 minutes later, her stomach went cold. On the check, $42.70, under tip $1.00. Total $43.70. She stared at the single line of ink as if another digit might arrive if she wished hard enough. Noah's eyebrow climbed theatrically from behind his bottles. Kelsey, who loved a show when she wasn't starring, drifted over like a shark who'd taught herself to walk. "Wow," Kelsey said, the vowels stretched with petty delight. "He must have really loved your air and hope." Alina breathed through her nose, slow, like she taught Mateo to do when his chest got tight. It wasn't that she thought she deserved more. It was that the dollar, smooth and obscene in its loneliness, made her feel like a joke, and she did not have the budget for jokes that cut. She had worked an hour like a ghost child who had to be solid when someone reached for a fork. She had done the math in her head about the inhaler, the last of the cereal, the eviction notice with its curdled threat. The difference between a kind tip and this wasn't a yacht. The difference was bus fare. The difference was whether she counted herself as someone who mattered. She turned over the bill and the dollar, and her pen found her hand before she decided what to do. On the margin of the receipt, in the scratchy printing Mateo used when he was trying to make her smile, she wrote, "Thank you for coming in." And on the dollar, along its white border, she wrote, "Make it matter." Then she walked to the corkboard by the register, the one she'd started 2 months ago when a man came in with a soaked backpack and empty eyes, and she pinned the dollar to the board under the handwritten sign, "Take what you need. Leave what you can." It wasn't a super savers bin or a charity scam. It was mostly index cards with words, freedom, steadiness, forgiveness, stuffed into clothespins, each card printed in slanted script from a stash she kept in her apron. Sometimes people slid spare change into the tiny glass jar below the board. Sometimes she used it to cover a bus fare or a coffee for a man who came in from the cold and stood at the doorway, like he didn't know if he deserved to be inside. "Are you defacing government property?" Kelsey's voice had a gleam to it. "I'm making it matter," Alina said. Her hands didn't shake, and that was good because the rest of her did. Kelsey inhaled as if the oxygen in the room belonged to her by right. "You don't get to decide the charity of this restaurant," Kelsey said. "And you definitely don't get to augment tips. That dollar belongs to the pool." "It belongs to the person who needs it," Alina said, and surprised herself with how calm it sounded. Kelsey pointed to the back office like a judge pointing to the gallows. "5 minutes, then I want you back on the floor, and you're on notice, Alina, again." Noah rolled his eyes so hard she could practically hear it. "She's a joy," he muttered. Alina went to the back office and stood by the metal desk with the burn marks. There were schedules thumbtacked to the wall with names highlighted in jaundiced yellow. There was a jar of mints on the desk that had been there since the last manager, which meant before Alina had started. The office smelled like old paper and stale ambition. "You can't run your own little social experiment in here," Kelsey said when she closed the door. "You put that dollar in the pool now." Alina's throat tightened. "Then take it from me at the register. Front of house has eyes. I'm not going to pull it from the corkboard like a thief." Kelsey stared at her. "Don't get righteous." "I'm tired," Alina said. "Not righteous." Kelsey leaned across the desk. "There are 20 girls in this city who want your hours. You have a kid, Alina. If you need to feed him, maybe don't antagonize the hand that signs your check." Alina thought of the inhaler. She thought of Mateo sitting cross-legged at the chipped coffee table in the living room with his drawing pencils arranged like soldiers, his chest making that small, high sound when he got excited. She thought of her mother's voice, low and fierce, saying, "Baby, you can't spend your soul to pay a bill." "I'll finish my shift," Alina said, mouth dry, "and we'll split the tips like normal, but I'm not unpinning that dollar. You'll have to do it." Kelsey's eyes went flat. "You're done at the end of today," she said. "I'll write the termination as insubordination to keep unemployment honest." The word "done" was a button under Alina's ribs. She pressed it to keep from breaking. "Okay," she said, because sometimes that's the only word that works. She finished the shift the way you finish a show when you know the curtain is falling. She smiled until it hurt. She remembered refills before anyone asked. She told stories about the weather and pancakes and the right kind of salt to rim a glass on a day when the wind had teeth. Noah moved around her like the stagehand who drops things from the rafters and makes them look like stars. At 2:30 she clocked out and untied her apron like a soldier taking off his armor. She walked out into the cold with her hands in her coat pockets to keep from balling them into fists. The man from table 13 stood across the street, leaning against a dented lamppost. He wasn't looking at her, not exactly. He was looking at the board through the window, the dollar pinned to it like a small, determined flag. Alina had that peculiar sensation of being read about in a book you didn't know you were in. She could have kept walking. She almost did. But she stepped off the curb and crossed the street and stopped in front of him. Up close, the world took him into sharper focus. He had the shadows under his eyes of someone who earned or borrowed them. Was the coffee not strong enough? Alina said, a ghost of a smile. It was perfect. And the tip, she said it before she could decide if it was wise. The wind picked up and threaded its fingers through her hair. Was that perfect too? He looked at her full on with a seriousness that felt like a spotlight. No, he said. It was intentional. Intentional and perfect aren't the same word, she said. She watched a gull strut along the curb as if it knew facts about the ocean she did not. Why? He hesitated like the truth was a piece of furniture he wasn't sure he could fit down the stairs. I wanted to see who you were when it didn't pay. Her laugh was short and sharp, more clink than song. I'm a waitress, she said. It doesn't pay most days. I know what it's like, he said. She looked at his coat, his boots, the clean line of his haircut. Do you? It wasn't a question. He tightened his hand around the lamppost. My mother worked double shifts at 2 diners until her wrists gave out. I know what it looks like when someone builds a world out of small kindnesses because nobody gave her the big ones. Alina felt herself lean toward him before her better sense yanked her back. Who are you? She wanted to ask. Instead, and so you left me $1 and watched. It was a test, he admitted. I'm not proud of that, but it's true. I run projects. I'm building something called First Brick. I'm looking for people who show integrity when nobody's looking, who make decisions that tip the scale even when it hurts. His eyes flicked towards the window where the corkboard glowed in February light like a strange altar. I chose the worst kind of measure. I wanted to see if you chased me down. I wanted to see if you pocketed it. I wanted to see if, he stopped. If what? If you did what you just did. Alina waited for the ringmaster to step out from behind a fish crate and announce she'd won a prize. Nothing happened. The wind pushed past them like an impatient ant. You wanted to see if I was generous with something I needed, she said, and you wanted to know that without having to talk to me like a person. He flinched. She didn't mean it as violence. It came out harder than she intended, but she could feel the day rearranging around them as if a crucial bit of gravity had shifted. He held out a small rectangle of cream paper. It was ridiculous and old-fashioned and expensive in the way paper could be. My card, he said. Julian Harrow. The name sat on the paper like a stone thrown into a quiet pond. Alina blinked before her brain delivered the context. Harrow. The company that owned most of the skyline, the shipping firm that had turned into a tech investment hydra, the name that showed up on donation plaques and investigative journalism with equal enthusiasm. Alina, he said gently when she didn't take the card. This is not a trick. If you'll talk with me, I can explain. She took the card because you take what the day gives you. She turned it over and expected to find a map of escape routes. Instead, there was the embossed outline of a brick. The world made itself bigger and smaller at the same time. You know, she said, sliding the card into the pocket where she kept Mateo's bus pass, that $1 didn't change me. It just revealed the math I've been doing since I could add. And what's the math? He asked. That you can't hoard your way out of drowning, she said. She nodded towards the board. Sometimes you throw what you have on the water and hope it turns into a bridge. I want to fund the bridge, Julian said. I want to fund 100 of them. She looked at him and saw not just a man with a wallet big enough to fix things, but a man who had learned to fix things before he learned to say sorry. There it was, the root of something. I can't talk today, she said. I have to pick my kid up from school and I'll be looking for a new job by dinner. Tomorrow. He asked, I'll meet you wherever. A coffee, no tests. Alina thought of the eviction notice, the inhaler, the way Kelsey's voice had wrapped around the word done. She thought of the $1 on the board. The tug inside her was not greed. It was the urge to make the numbers stop attacking her life. Tomorrow, she said, at 4, there's a place on 3rd with a blue door. You can't miss it. I'll tell you why I shouldn't take your money. He nodded once, as if a judge had granted him probation. I'll be there. She walked away without turning back. It felt like moving through a door you built yourself. Julian Harrow sat in the back of his black car as the harbor peeled by his window, gulls plotting on his behalf like they had nothing better to do with their criminal minds. His assistant had texted 3 times about a lunch with the mayor he'd agreed to weeks ago and no longer wanted. The board had emailed about an acquisition that would make shareholders faint with pleasure and employees faint at their desks. The Harrow Foundation's PR lead had sent a draft of a speech in which he apologized for nothing in several elegant paragraphs. He ignored it all. He watched the window as if the glass were instruction. His mother, May Harrow, had been 32 when he tasted milkshake foam off the back of her spoon in a diner with a jukebox that played songs she swayed to in the kitchen after midnight. She used to leave drawings for strangers under salt shakers, a bird with too many feathers, a sun with no face. She called it passing on the sugar. As a teenager, he had rolled his eyes. As a man, he poured billions into making other people do the same thing and called it a strategy. He had built himself a fortress, money as stone, control as mortar. He had built doors too, he told himself. But this morning he had left $1 on a table like a trap and felt the old shame flood his throat when he watched her navigate it. He had expected a protest, a wounded surrender, an eye roll made out of a broken heart. He had not expected a corkboard that transformed small things into a ladder. He had not expected the words "make it matter." He had tipped poorly for reasons he told himself mattered. It was not an experiment to be famous on YouTube. It was a measure, and measures were what he dealt in. His world was graphs and analyzes. His foundation had funded microloans to women in rural towns who turned trash into rugs, tiny grants to teenagers who invented cheap water filters. He had looked for those who multiplied proper nouns like opportunity and resilience because the proper nouns had been denied them. And yet he had played God with a dollar bill like a boy pulling legs off a fly to see what it would do if it had to learn to crawl again. She had looked at him like she was not asking for permission to be angry. He did not know what to do with that, which was maybe why it mattered. Back in the office, glass and steel, a view of the city like a photograph from a god who loved grids, he told Simone to cancel the mayor. Simone, who knew when to ask questions and when to weaponize iced coffee, asked none, texted the mayor's chief of staff and placed a sweating cup on his desk. "You know anything about the harbor and hearth?" Julian asked, focusing on a smear of something on his cuff. Jam. He had not eaten jam in 10 years for reasons that had more to do with control than fruit. "We own a slice of the parent company," Simone said, "among other slices of other pies." "Get rid of it," he said. He could feel the part of him that liked making big decisions in a voice other people had to learn to obey. Simone blinked once, which was how she said, "Are you sure you want to do that in a hurry?" "Not the company," he amended. "The practice of skimming tips if it's happening, or anything like it." "On it," she said. "And you're 4 o'clock," he pictured a blue door, the kind you only see when you need it. Simone gave him a look that in another life would have kept him from falling downstairs. "Wear something normal," she said. "And for once, tell the truth without bullet points." He did not know how to dress normal. His closet organized him into categories he stopped questioning. He chose a peacoat, jeans that cost more than jeans should, a sweater that made his mother's picture on the bookshelf look at him either fondly or with mild disdain, depending on the light. The cafe on 3rd had a blue door the exact color of a bruise healing. Inside, plants hung from the ceiling like small forests, and the light did a kind thing to faces. Elena was already there, a paper cup in both hands, eyes on the middle distance. She wore a denim jacket buttoned to the second button even though it was cold enough for breath to pretend it was winter fog. A child's drawing poked from her tote, a house with arms, a sun with eyebrows. He sat. He did not put his hands on the table. He looked at his reflection in the window because sometimes that kept him honest. "You're Harrow," she said, his name a weight. "I am," she nodded like that was a fact she would file under dangerous but useful. "Do you know why you shouldn't help me?" "I have a list," he tried, then corrected. "Tell me." "Because when people like you help people like me," she said, "you get a story and I get an obligation." He swallowed. "I don't want your story. I want to build something that keeps working whether or not I'm in the photograph." "You left me $1 to see if I'd pass a test I didn't know I was taking," she said bluntly. "That's a photograph. You like the click." He did not argue. "There's another reason," she said, and his skin knew the reason before his ears did. She pulled her tote onto the chair and fished out a folded copy of the local paper, brittle as winter. She flattened it on the table between them so he could read the 2-inch headline, "Warehouse Collapse Kills 1, Injures 5. The photo was a building that had forgotten how to stand. He remembered it before he read the date. 10 years ago, Harrow Logistics, a secondary support beam that had been replaced with a cheaper part under a manager who had looked at profit and seen God. His legal team had made it cost him. The family of the man who died had received a settlement behind a non-disclosure agreement. The man had a mustache that curled like laughter. The article had not mentioned the names, the court cases had kept them quiet. But he had read the report like it was a story you told about someone else so that you could stand to listen. That was my father, Alina said, voice level. He was on a break. He tried to help someone get out when the first crack went. He didn't make it to the door. Julian felt like he had been punctured in a place you could not bandage. Don't say sorry, she said. There was no cruelty to it, just the exhaustion of a word that had been poured over a wound so often it had become sticky instead of clean. I don't know if you knew, it doesn't matter. You built the ship. The captain drowned. He looked at the picture like you can change the past if you stare hard enough. His mouth formed words without permission. We paid. She picked up the sentence and laid it gently on the floor between them. You paid money, he is still dead. They sat with that impossible equation between them while the cafe hummed around them in notes of milk foam and laptop clicks. He found his voice under the table like a dropped napkin. First Brick is a program, he said carefully, to fund people who build ladders in neighborhoods where the stairs have been burned. $500 can change the shape of a week. 5,000 can change a year. I want to give that quietly to people like you, through people like you. Alina stared at him, and he had the sensation of being examined by someone who could see the code beneath his skin. What do you want in return? I want to learn, he said, and saw how insufficient that sounded. I want to do repairs that outlast applause. Repairs. She repeated the word as if it were a foreign coin she wasn't sure belonged in the country. My father used to say repair is the noblest craft. She touched the headline. The settlement helped for a year, then the grief ate the money because that's what grief does. I picked up shifts. Mateo's dad left. He didn't want to be a father anymore, which I suppose is honest. My mother died 3 years after the collapse with a heart that had simply had enough practice. There have been so many dollars since then, and none of them fixed me. He felt something in him loosen like a knot that had been braved too long. I cannot fix you, he said. I can fix me. I can fix a portion of the machine that took your father. I can give you money in a way that does not brand your back. She watched him like the sea watches a seawall. How? I'll start with the company, he said. We will audit the facilities, not like before, real audits with the right people. We will look for the rot. I will not send a speech. I will send crew with hammers and checks. We will set up a fund, not a performative fund, a fund for injuries and families without NDA. And First Brick, if you agree, should be yours to run, with oversight so that it doesn't turn into a different kind of rot, but not mine to hold up on a stage. You want me to run a program? The disbelief was nearly gentle. I want to pay you to do what you already do, he said, to build systems out of kindness. What if I take the money and disappear? She asked. You could, he said. I'd probably let you. She snorted. It sounded like relief getting a minute in the light. I wouldn't, she said. I have to pick up my kid at 3 every day, and he will ask what I did, and the only answer that works is something that is true. She looked down at the coffee like it might supply a word she had misplaced. Harrow, she said, saying his name like the tool that turns soil, you should know I don't believe in being saved. Good, he said. Me neither. He took out his wallet, not to pull cash, but to take out the dollar he had pinned to a memory in his head. He had taken a picture of it through the window so that his pride wouldn't look like a thief. He slid the phone across the table, the photo bright and unapologetic, make it matter in her slanted hand. May I make this your signature, he asked. The dollar. The words, he said, your mother called it passing on the sugar. Mine told me that she had no sugar left to pass until she did, and she never forgot the taste. Alina's eyes softened at the edges. We're not done, she warned. You will mess up. I will not let you whitewash it. I will not carry the weight of your penance. You fix what you broke. I'll build what we need. Yes, he said, the word holding more room than it had any right to. They talked until the late afternoon stretched and someone put the chairs on tables. Julian told her about his mother and the way a boy learns to use money as armor. Alina told him about Mateo's laugh when a dog sneezed, about the night she stayed up folding origami stars out of eviction notices because she could not stand to look at the word for another minute. He told her about a warehouse in Ohio that had almost fallen and didn't because one woman had refused to sign off on substandard bolts. She told him about the corkboard and the man who came in on Tuesdays with a new poem folded in his pocket and left 50 cents like he was tipping the moon. He did not tell her that boards of directors did not like the shape of his promises. He would tell them later to learn better shapes. At 5, she stood, smoothing a wrinkle from her jacket with a palm that had learned to make fabric obey. I have to go, she said. If this is a story, it's a long one. I'll meet your people tomorrow. She lifted her chin. But not in your office, in the diner, before Kelsey takes the board down. He smiled with half his mouth because that was the half he trusted to be honest. Our people will be there. He held out his hand. She took it. It was not a contract. It was a bridge. When the idea of First Brick rolled, it rolled quickly once it had weight. That was both the good news and the bad. Once an idea got speed in Harrow's world, it flattened what wasn't ready and paved over what was complicated. Alina insisted on speed with breaks. She met with Simone, who had a gaze like a well-oiled machine and an affectionate scowl that made Alina like her almost immediately. In a booth at Harbor and Hearth before opening, the gulls scandalized by the early hour. They ordered pancakes for the table and coffee as if it could solve architecture. Kelsey hovered, polite because of the suits and still impatient because of the hour. "This is the agreement," Simone said, sliding a stack of paper across syrup rings. "Employment as Director of Small Grants Initiative, first brick, salary like a kindergarten teacher in a fancy suburb. Benefits because this job will eat your bones if you don't protect them. Autonomy in applicant selection with a board comprised of people like me," Alina finished. She reflexively reached for a pen and wrote on the back of her napkin, "Integrity, urgency, reach." And a rule: no photos of recipients held like trophies, no staged moments, no obligations, just a story if they want to tell it. "Agreed," Simone said, without the hedging Alina had braced for. She had the feeling that if she asked for the moon in writing, Simone would at least ask the moon if it had a minute. "What about the other thing?" Alina said, voice low. The word other in this case meant the thing that had crushed a portion of her life. "We have a plan," Simone said. "Third-party audits, retrofits, a fund. Julian is prepared for discomfort and for lawsuits." Simone glanced at Kelsey. "And this place?" "Alina's choice," Julian said, emerging from the kitchen where he'd been talking to the dishwasher in a way that made the dishwasher laugh. He had rolled up his sleeves like he thought that counted. Alina wanted to be annoyed at the theater of it and found to her annoyance that she appreciated the effort. "If this is where you want to meet applicants, if this is where you want to keep the board, if this is where you want the office hours, the lease is paid for a year." Kelsey stared like a dog watching a magic trick. "We're good, actually," she said, recovering her shape. "We thrive on community." She looked at Alina as if making a decision. "If we create a separate space in the side room, I can let your whatever this is operate twice a week, but the board stays regulated and we'll track the jar for accuracy." Alina looked at Julian. "You're an investor here." "For now," he said, "but not for long." He took a breath. "Alina, listen, you can hate me for being entangled in this. I hate me for being entangled in this. But if the fastest way is through, I will go through and I will leave if you tell me to. The board belongs to you." She didn't forgive him. Forgiveness was a church she had never felt at home in. But she took her small square of power and folded it into a plane. "We'll meet there," she said. "Wednesdays and Sundays, and we'll start with one rule for applicants." "What's that?" Simone asked, poised to write. "They must already be building," Alina said. "We're not funding whims, we're funding the hands holding the ladder." The first week, the line past the blue door was thin. News didn't travel as fast as shame. A girl with chipped nail polish and a jaw like stubbornness asked for enough money to buy safety locks for the windows in her mother's apartment. A woman who braided hair like a second language asked for a grant to order hypoallergenic extensions for clients who were allergic to beauty that itched. A boy who played violin like a prayer asked for bus fare to get to a competition he had earned. They were not dramatic. They were precise. Alina watched each face for the same thing, resolve that had not yet calcified into cynicism, and found it like a pulse. Every applicant signed a promise, not a contract, make it matter. They wrote a sentence about what that meant. They faced no cameras. They left with envelopes that smelled like paper and possibility. Alina's name was not on the envelope, neither was Julian's. Which did not mean the story stayed quiet. It leaked because good things leak the way bad ones do. Someone posted a photo of the corkboard with the note in Alina's handwriting and the caption, "This is how you build a city." It was shared by a poet with 1 million followers and an aunt in Cleveland with 12. People came in with dollars, fives, tens, pinning them under words like warmth and time. Kelsey pretended to hate it and then started cleaning the area around the board herself. Then the backlash arrived like weather. An opinion column accused Harrow of laundering his conscience through single moms. Another cul-de-sac chorus accused Alina of being a prop. A man with a podcast and no discernible hobbies aside from outrage called First Brick, pennies on a bloody floor. Alina told Simone she didn't care and then stayed up until 2 reading the comments and lost a day to hating strangers with strong Wi-Fi. "Don't read the comments," Noah said, handing her a ginger ale. She sat on the floor behind the board because it felt like leaning against something built by the same species that had made her this tired. At night, after Matteo fell asleep with a book on his chest that smelled like school and crayons, she graduated her grief and anger into tasks. She drafted a budget that did not leave room for jewelry or speeches. She visited the old warehouse site where the gravel had been replaced, and the ugly memory had been polished into the kind of plaque that made people nod solemnly after lunch. She met with lawyers who said words she repeated until they lost their power to scare. On a Wednesday, the side door of the diner opened, and a woman entered with a cane and a cardigan like a cloud. She held herself with the dignity of a person who'd cut her teeth on politeness and found that it fit even on days it didn't feel good against your gums. "May I speak to the director?" she asked, and Alina stood and said, startled, "That's me." The woman's eyes filled with tears. Alina, alarmed, reached for napkins because napkins were what life gives you to stop what you can't stop. "I'm sorry," the woman said. "I promised I wouldn't be a spectacle." She smiled in apology, and Alina's body recognized it. It was the same sorry her mother had worn the day the cashier had pretended not to see her count coupons. "Take your time," Alina said, which was the thing she had always needed to hear and hardly ever had. "I worked 30 years, the woman said, cleaning office buildings, quiet work, the kind nobody applauds, no insurance because the contractor was a friend of the cousin of a lord." She laughed, a hiccup that learned to look like music. "I have arthritis that shoots lightning down my bones. I knit hats to keep from thinking about how much it turns me into weather." "My neighbor's boy," she said, softening. "He wants to start a carpentry workshop here because the wood shop at school is a closet. He needs a saw table. I need $300 for heat patches and a seat on the bus when I can't stand a minute longer. I can endure, but why should I endure when there are other options?" Alina swallowed around a crowd of emotion in her throat. "We can do both," she said. She slid 2 envelopes across the table like cards that changed the game. "And if anyone says this is a handout, you can tell them it's a hand up, and if anyone hates that phrase, you can tell them it's simply a hand. The kind a person uses to open a door or a jar or a heart." The woman laughed like it hurt beautifully. "You have a gift," she said. "I don't," Alina answered without false modesty. "I have a need, and a lot of napkins." By spring, First Brick had funded 40 projects. A prenatal yoga class in a basement with lavender walls for women who could not afford the quiet and the stretching. A micro-library in a barber shop where kids could borrow books and earn haircuts for reading aloud. A refrigerator outside a church that hummed with food and was emptied with respect. Take what you need. Leave what you can. The city noticed in the way cities do. They wrote a grant, they sent a camera, they asked for metrics. Alina learned to speak their language without dropping nouns like just or a little. She discovered she was good at it, in the way that matters when your goodness might be the difference between somebody keeping their apartment and somebody losing their footing. Julian watched quietly, often at the edges, sometimes at the blue door with a baseball cap pulled low for no reason because everyone who mattered knew his face. He took the fights to his board and came back with bruises you couldn't see. He put his body in uncomfortable rooms where men who wore their ties like swords told him he was gutting shareholder value for soup kitchens. He rolled up his sleeves and crawled under the metaphorical sink in the warehouse and found corroded pipes. He signed a check that would never be a headline to a man with a mustache like laughter in a framed photo on a mantel that read, "For what you were owed," without signing away your right to tell the story. He didn't tell Alina about every victory because he didn't know if victory was the right word. He told her when something mattered. He told her when he messed up, and he did mess up. He set up a press conference he thought he could control. The local reporters asked Alina how she justified taking money from a man who had profited off pain. She said what she believed: "I will use anyone's money to make sure a kid gets to school breathing," and the internet alternated between praise and fury. A client of Harbor and Hearth sent in $500 in pennies with a note that read "Charity Case." Kelsey cried in the office after closing when she saw the jar, and Alina held her hand and did not say "I told you so," even though she had. Julian threatened to send the pennies back letter by letter. Alina told him to give them to a kindergarten teacher for a counting lesson. "Make that matter," she wrote on the envelope, and he laughed for the first time in days that had tasted like Flint. In June, the city installed a new mural on the long wall by the bus depot. It wasn't sanctioned. They appeared at night like hope and left paint like a secret handshake. In the center, a slim woman in a denim jacket reached toward a small boy whose hand stretched toward hers. Between them, a string of paper stars that used to be eviction notices turned into constellations. Above them both, in generous letters, "Make it matter." Alina stood staring at it on a morning when the air smelled like donut grease and second chances. Matteo tugged her sleeve. "That's you," he said, delighted. "No," she corrected, smiling. "That's all of us." She took her finger and traced one star as if tracing a vein under skin. A woman next to her, on her way to work at the hospital with a badge that said dietitian and a lunch bag with a cartoon broccoli. Cried silently, not messy, not for show, but like water finds a crack and remembers oceans. Alina squeezed her shoulder. Sometimes that was the only song. The first real twist came not from media or money, but from inside. A man came into the diner with hair that had not learned the difference between wind and style. He asked for coffee and a cinnamon roll and sat under the board and looked at the dollar with the words written on it like it was a relic. Alina thought trouble and mercy often wore the same coat. I have a proposal, he said, sliding into her orbit mid-shift. He smelled like expensive soap and mistakes. Corporate synergy, brand, will match the first brick grants dollar for dollar if you put our logo on your… He gestured to the board like a priest blessing an altar he planned to sell. You want me to turn this into an ad, Alina said, not a question. A partnership, he corrected, eyes shining like a thing that wants to be loved. Can the partnership feed kids when the brand has a scandal? She asked coolly. If we structure it, can the partnership stand if you pull your money because a reporter writes something that makes your board angry? He hesitated. That was the only answer she needed. She said thank you in the way people say thank you when they do not want to throw something and walked away. The second twist came courtesy of the past Alina had thought was done with her. Nadine, the leasing agent who had slid termination under her door, walked into the diner with a baby on her hip and different eyes. Alina, she said, breathless. I'm sorry about last year. I was told to write certain letters. I got laid off. I'm starting a tenant advocacy resource. Can you? She held out a folder as if it might burn if she kept holding it. Alina took it. Of course, she said simply. We can make your work one of the bricks. On a blistered Thursday, Kelsey called Alina into the office and closed the door. Alina braced for that familiar gallows. Kelsey, instead of sharpening her tone, softened her face. I'm not good at this, she said, surprising even herself. Admitting when I did wrong, I took from the tip pool not much, not always, just some. The jar made me angry because it looked like a mirror. I wanted to break it. Alina's first reaction was not anger. It was the knowledge that broke people break things. Fix it, she said. Pay it back and say it out loud. Kelsey did. She sent a memo to staff. She stood on a chair before opening and said loud enough for the kitchen to hear, I skimmed. I'm paying restitution. It was wrong. Noah cried because he was sentimental, and men who cry behind bars deserve medals. Alina handed Kelsey the napkin tradition behind the board and watched her write in clean printing, I will be different. Julian watched from the door, the sunlight making a saint out of his outline for a second, which was ironic and obscene and also very funny. He did not speak. He put his hand on the board lightly as if checking a pulse. The third twist came quietly, which is how some storms behave. A letter arrived addressed to Alina. Inside, a copy of a check she had written to the pharmacy for an inhaler a year ago with the word denied stamped in red. Tucked into the envelope, a handwritten note, I was the clerk who told you we couldn't refill. I sobbed in the bathroom after. I took the $38 from the register and pretended to miscount until the drawer balanced, and I put it into that jar at your diner because I couldn't stand one kind of ethics over another. Thank you for making me feel like I wasn't a thief. Alina stood in the storage closet with the letter against her chest and the mop bucket at her feet and cried like the kind of person who will keep going because she knows what it costs to stop. News broke at the end of summer that Harrow Logistics would sell its most controversial arm for a fraction of what it could make. Shareholders grumbled into cufflinks. Pricks with subscriptions wrote op-eds about noblesse oblige. The Fund for Injuries and Families went live quietly with a neat website that did not have Julian's face. People signed in and told their stories to lawyers who had been paid enough to know they worked for humans, not for narratives. The lawsuits materialized anyway and marched. Julian's board staged a rebellion that could end in exile. He did not flinch because a woman had pinned $1 to a board and reminded him that the worst kind of measure is the one that multiplies your pride. Alina visited the warehouse where her father had died with a bouquet of sunflowers and a hammer. She sat on the cracked curb and talked to him as if he had been waiting for an update. I'm going to ask him to name the fund after you, she said. He will say no because he thinks names belong to certain rooms. I will tell him that names belong to the dead too. She hammered a nail into the wooden post and hung a small square sign she had painted herself in Mateo's blue, Make It Matter. Mateo helped because he liked hitting things and being allowed to say he was helping. They celebrated at the diner because people need parties to remind them they know how to proceed. The staff made a cake from things in the pantry and a memory of Food Network. Noah played a playlist that started with Old Soul and ended with Beyoncé because why not? Julian showed up late with sleeves rolled and a bruise on his cheekbone shaped like an asshole board member's ring, figuratively if not literally. Alina looked at him and for once didn't want to interrogate him. She wanted to sit and rest in a victory that wasn't pure and was still beautiful. Dance, Noah demanded, drunk on frosting. It's a rule. He dragged Alina into the narrow space near the server station where dancing was less a physical act and more a defiance you did with your hands. She let herself laugh, the kind that comes from a place that's been dry too long. Julian, who danced like a person who had never learned to be silly without a spreadsheet, moved his shoulders. People cheered because humans love to see statues come to life. Alina reached out and touched the scar on his knuckle he'd gotten when he was 17 and punched a door. He looked at her like she had touched a word that hurt and healed at once. They did not fall in love in the way movies ask you to believe in. They fell into something better and harder and realer. They became co-conspirators, arguments in the morning, strategies in the afternoon, exhausted gratitude at night via text. They set boundaries and tripped on them and set them again. Alina dated a math teacher who could name all the stars and didn't like coffee. Julian met someone who laughed like May Harrow and told him when he was ridiculous, which, despite his investments, was more often than he knew. None of it was tidy. All of it mattered. On a winter night a year later, Alina found an old dollar in the pocket of her coat. She thought it was the dollar. It wasn't. It was just a dollar. She smiled because that was the point. She went to the board, now so heavy with bills and words that it looked like a heart stuffed with everything it had loved, and she pinned the dollar to the corner because rituals are how we tell time. A boy came up on tiptoes and tugged at it. He looked up at her with eyes too large for his face. "Is it okay?" he asked. "Take it," she said, and one of the words. He picked courage because of course he did. He folded it into his pocket with the solemnity of a ceremony and ran outside into the winter air like a dog who had learned his own name. Alina watched him go. Julian came up behind her and did not put his hand on her back because he had learned not to touch the saints when they're at work. "Do you ever think about what you would have done if I hadn't left that dollar?" he asked, the kind of question you ask when you're warm enough and safe enough to pull a thread. "I probably would have left my own," she said, "or a word, or both. I was always going to build something, you just gave me a piece of wood to add to it." He exhaled, like a prayer he didn't know he knew. "You changed my life," he said quietly. She shook her head. "No, I changed mine, you changed yours, the rest of us helped each other." He leaned against the board. The glow from the window painted him in diner gold. The world outside was a cold, clear square of night. "Do you think," he asked, "we get to know when something matters as much as we hope it will?" "Sometimes," she said. "When you're lucky, sometimes you just keep hammering and trust someone will use the steps." He nodded, as if he was making a promise to the air. "You know," he said, "I framed the photo of the dollar with your words. It's in my office." "You don't get to keep the story," she told him, grinning. "I know," he said. "I lend it, like a library." She reached up and brushed an eyelash off his cheek, a gesture so intimate it felt like family. He caught her wrist and squeezed once before letting go. The bell over the door rang. A woman in scrubs came in with fatigue hanging from her shoulders like a backpack. She went to the board and took an index card that said rest and a $5 bill with tape-marked scars. Alina watched her carefully fold them and tuck them into her front pocket. The woman saw Alina looking and smiled with half her mouth as if she was embarrassed to be human. "Make it matter," Alina mouthed. The woman nodded. That was the ceremony. In the years that followed, First Brick replicated in other neighborhoods in other cities. Some worked better than others. People accused it of not being enough. People accused it of enabling. People accused it of revolution. It was always doing fewer things than some demanded and more than others could imagine. Alina grew older in the kind way, laugh lines migrating to places that surprised her. Matteo grew into his lungs and into a boy who built a wooden table that wobbled less than most things sounded at 13. He left notes under salt shakers like a genetic echo. When Alina died, late, as is proper, with Matteo's hand on hers and a blanket tucked tight because she'd always been cold, there was no newspaper article about the way she had changed the world. There were 1,000 small things you could count if you knew where to look: a violin that had crossed a river, a fridge that hummed through a summer, a boy who never learned hunger as a first language, a warehouse that didn't fall. At her memorial, they did not read a list of donors. They read 10 two-sentence stories from people who had taken envelopes and written sentences after. They pinned a dollar to a board and passed it down, and each person wrote on its white border. The room was full of words. The words were better than money. Julian stood in the back, hand flat against the cool glass of the window, the city outside the shape of possibilities that could not be put back into a smaller container. He looked at the board and the words and the dollar that now read like a chorus and thought of the worst and best kinds of measure. He thought of a woman with dishwater slick fingers flipping over his test and turning it into a bridge. He thought of how sometimes you are not saved and you save, and both can be the same story told from different rooms. After everyone left, he took off his suit jacket and rolled his sleeves. He untied the board from the wall and cradled it like a tired child. He carried it to the new harbor and hearth, a different location, newer chairs, newer grief, and hung it where the light did a kind thing mid-morning. He pulled $1 from his wallet, the kind that had no memory yet, and wrote in his clumsy hand, "Make it matter." He pinned it and stepped back. A bus pulled up outside and exhaled. Gulls argued above. The bell over the door rang, and the country of small miracles went about its governance as it always had, as it always would.